Ibrahim Traoré's bold leadership in Burkina Faso has not only become a source of national pride, but also a mirror that reflects the weaknesses of many African governments still entangled in the legacies of colonial dependency, elite capture, and mismanagement. At a time when Africa is facing mounting challenges of poverty, unemployment, debt, and political instability, Traoré's stance has captured global attention as an example of what uncompromising sovereignty and people-centered governance could look like. In contrast, South Africa under Cyril Ramaphosa and the African National Congress, once the celebrated liberation movement that dismantled apartheid and brought hope to millions, finds itself struggling with a crisis of credibility, policy paralysis, and a deep disconnect from the people it once vowed to uplift. The juxtaposition between these two leaders and their governments offers a sobering lesson about Africa's current crossroads. Traoré, the young captain who rose to power in Burkina Faso during a turbulent period, has chosen a path defined by defiance against neo-colonial structures and a commitment to restoring dignity to his people. His rhetoric and actions resonate far beyond Burkina Faso's borders because they speak to long-standing grievances across the continent. Grievances about exploitation of natural resources, foreign interference, and the inability of African leaders to assert their sovereignty in the global order. His courage has given rise to renewed debates about what leadership in Africa should mean in the 21st century. A leadership that is bold, uncompromising, and rooted in the service of ordinary citizens rather than the appeasement of foreign capitals or entrenched elites. Ramaphosa, on the other hand, represents the challenges of a liberation movement turned governing party that has lost its sense of purpose and revolutionary spirit. The ANC's long history of sacrifice and triumph against apartheid is undeniable, but decades of being in power have eroded its credibility. South Africa today stands as one of the most unequal societies in the world, plagued by rolling blackouts, rampant corruption scandals, and an economy that fails to generate sufficient opportunities for its youth. While Ramaphosa himself has attempted to brand his presidency as a renewal project after the controversial Jacob Zuma years, his government has often been characterized by indecision, slow reforms, and a failure to inspire confidence among the very people who entrusted the ANC with power. In this light, Traoré's boldness casts a shadow on Ramaphosa's cautiousness, making visible the gulf between rhetoric and action. The differences between Burkina Faso and South Africa are, of course, vast. One is a small landlocked nation with limited resources and a fragile security environment, while the other is Africa's most industrialized economy with regional influence and global recognition. Yet, paradoxically, it is Burkina Faso under Traoré that appears to embody a new spirit of Pan-African independence, while South Africa under the ANC appears stuck in a cycle of stagnation. This paradox is at the heart of the conversation sweeping across Africa. Why is a small, struggling nation able to inspire hope, while a country with immense potential fails to deliver on its promises? Traoré's leadership style is direct and uncompromising. His rejection of foreign domination, particularly from former colonial powers, has struck a chord with Africans who see too many of their governments bowing to Western pressure. By expelling foreign military forces that he deemed unhelpful, redirecting economic policies toward self-sufficiency, and openly embracing Pan-African alliances, he has redefined what it means for an African leader to stand tall in the global arena. His speeches are fiery, unapologetic, and infused with the language of dignity and self-determination. For a continent that has long endured leaders who prioritize external validation over domestic well-being, Traoré's approach feels refreshing and revolutionary. Ramaphosa's leadership style, in contrast, is marked by caution and technocratic management. While he speaks of reform, investment, and renewal, his words often fall flat against the backdrop of worsening crises. South Africans experience daily frustrations with electricity shortages, decaying infrastructure, and high levels of unemployment, especially among the youth. Corruption scandals continue to undermine trust, and the ANC itself is plagued by internal divisions that make decisive governance difficult. For many observers, Ramaphosa appears trapped by the very structures of the ANC, unable to break away from entrenched patronage networks and lacking the boldness needed to make unpopular but necessary decisions. The ANC's failings also reflect a deeper malaise that affects much of Africa: the struggle of liberation movements to transition into effective governing parties. Across the continent, many movements that once fought bravely for freedom have, once in power, become stagnant, corrupt, or authoritarian. They are weighed down by nostalgia for past glories, while failing to adapt to the demands of modern governance. The ANC is perhaps the most prominent example of this, where its moral capital from the anti-apartheid struggle is slowly being eroded by years of governance failures. In contrast, Traore represents a new generation of leaders untethered from the liberation narrative, focused instead on building a new African identity rooted in sovereignty and accountability. It is important to note that Traore's leadership is not without criticism. His rise through a military coup raises legitimate questions about democratic processes, and the challenges of governing in a fragile security environment are immense. Yet, for many Africans, the substance of his message outweighs the form of his ascension. They see in him a leader unafraid to name Africa's enemies, challenge the global economic order, and prioritize the dignity of his people above foreign approval. In this sense, his example becomes less about the technicalities of power and more about the spirit of leadership he embodies. Ramaphosa's South Africa, meanwhile, struggles to provide such inspiration. Despite its resources, institutions, and potential, it has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and weak governance. The promises of economic transformation, land reform, and social justice remain largely unfulfilled. Inequality has deepened, and disillusionment with the ANC is widespread. Younger generations who did not directly experience apartheid increasingly view the ANC not as liberators, but as part of the problem. This disillusionment is dangerous, as it undermines the social fabric and creates fertile ground for populism and unrest. The comparison between Traoré and Ramaphosa is not simply about individuals, but about models of leadership. Traoré represents boldness, clarity, and a willingness to challenge entrenched systems, while Ramaphosa represents caution, compromise, and entanglement with old structures. Africa, at this moment in history, faces a choice between these two paths: the path of bold, unapologetic sovereignty, or the path of cautious reform within the status quo. Across the continent, people are watching closely. They see how Burkina Faso, despite its limitations, has ignited conversations about Pan-African unity, self-reliance, and resistance to neo-colonialism. They also see how South Africa, despite its potential, has failed to lead Africa as it once did during the anti-apartheid struggle. This contrast is shaping perceptions of what Africa's future leadership should look like. It suggests that legitimacy in the eyes of Africans today is no longer based on liberation credentials or international approval, but on the ability to inspire, defend sovereignty, and deliver tangible change. The symbolic power of Traoré's example is immense. It challenges African leaders who have grown comfortable with mediocrity and dependency to rethink their approaches. It forces questions about why so many African governments remain beholden to external powers while smaller nations dare to defy them. It sparks debates about whether Africa's future lies in continued engagement with Western structures or in building new systems of cooperation rooted in African priorities. By standing firm, Traoré has disrupted the narrative that Africa must always bend to external will. For South Africa and the ANC, this moment is a wake-up call. Ramaphosa's government must grapple with the reality that its failings are not only domestic, but continental. Africa looks to South Africa for leadership, and when that leadership is weak, the entire continent suffers. By failing to inspire, by failing to act decisively, South Africa risks ceding its place as a moral and political leader in Africa to smaller but bolder nations. The broader lesson here is that Africa's liberation is not a single event in history, but an ongoing struggle. Political independence was only the first step. Economic independence, cultural sovereignty, and genuine self-determination remain unfinished business. Leaders like Traore remind Africans of this unfinished agenda, while the struggles of the ANC serve as a cautionary tale about what happens when liberation movements lose their vision. As the world enters a new era of multipolarity, Africa has unprecedented opportunities to redefine its place. The rise of BRICS, growing ties with Asia and the Middle East, and the resurgence of Pan-African movements all provide avenues for Africa to chart its own destiny. Yet seizing these opportunities requires leadership that is bold, visionary, and uncompromising. Traore symbolizes this possibility, while Ramaphosa embodies the risks of hesitation. In the final analysis, the contrast between Ibrahim Traoré and Cyril Ramaphosa is not just about Burkina Faso and South Africa, but about the future of Africa itself. Will the continent embrace bold, people-centered leadership that prioritizes sovereignty and dignity, or will it remain trapped in cycles of dependency and weak governance? The answer will determine whether Africa can truly rise in the 21st century or remain shackled by its past. Traoré's example is a challenge to every African leader to rise above compromise, to reject external domination, and to serve the people with courage. For Africa, the time of boldness is now.